Hey y'all, my name is Allie Delaney and I love history and makeup, so we are going to put the two together. And to preface this video, I am a Mary Kay consultant. I sell Mary Kay full-time, so that's what I'm going to be using in today's video when I do my makeup and tell you a story. I'm also a historian from the University of Wyoming. I do have my bachelor's degree from them, and I thought it'd be pretty cool to combine the two and tell you guys a story while I'm doing my makeup. So I hope you sit back and relax and let me learn you something. Today we're going to talk about Cattle Kate. Who was she? What was her story? How did she contribute to make an impact on Wyoming's history? And just to keep in mind with this story, the states aren't the 50 United States that we know now, okay? They were all territories back then. They weren't divided into states yet. So just keep that in mind when the story's going, okay? We've all heard that saying, well-behaved women rarely make history. So, did Kate truly misbehave to earn this moniker, or was she dealt a rough hand in the wild, wild west and was just trying to survive the craziness out here of lawlessness? I guess to form our opinions, we need to start at the very beginning. So Cattle Kate was born in Ontario, Canada. She was born on the 2nd of July in 1860. Her name was not Cattle Kate. She was born as Ellen Liddy Watson. Her parents, Thomas Lewis Watson and Frances Close Watson, were immigrants from Scotland. Ellen was the oldest of 10 children, and so she had to help her mom rear and raise all of these kids. So really, to look at it, that potentially built her character into the no-nonsense, hardworking woman with grit and determined personality that we see later on in her story. So, let's get started. So now that we know that Cattle Kate had 10 siblings and when she was born, where she was born, not much is known about Cattle Kate from her infancy to her mid-teen years. We do know that on her 17th year of living, that Ellen's dad decided to uproot his family in 1877 and move to Kansas. Societal standards in that period of history were harsh and unforgiving. Typically, a woman of Ellen's age would be married off by then and have a couple of bouncing babies on their hips. Marrying a man early to teens ensured a better survival rate for women during that time. It also kept them from the shunned life of prostitution and brothels. They were more protected as we didn't have as many rights as men. And we needed that extra protection, especially if we were not in our father's homes. So once the Watson family settled into their new life in Kansas, Ellen was 19 years old, and she had found work as a cook and a housekeeper for a wealthy man named H.R. Stone in 1879. This job not only gave Ellen independence, from her parents, and a roof over her head, food to eat, and a steady income. She was able to save a little bit, but it also led Ellen straight to her first husband, okay? His name was William A. Pickett. At the time, William was a farmhand laborer who had just recently finished his second bout of military service. Okay, so he was stationed at Fort Bridger, and he moved to, I want to say it was Fort Carson. He had been stationed around the front range for a while. Okay, so once he had finished his second term of military service, he had gotten out and was a farm laborer on a farm nearby to H.R. Stone's land. So that's how she met him. The two were wed quickly after meeting on the 24th of November, 1879. During their 4-year marriage, Ellen was unfortunately physically and verbally abused by William. And this happened for 4 years. Okay. So she suffered this tumultuous relationship, and unfortunately, William was a heavy drinker, and he probably got that from military life, being on his own. I'm not quite for sure. But he would beat her with a cattle rope, or a horsewhip, excuse me. And in the beginning of January 1883, after enduring the emotional and physical scars throughout the relationship, Ellen finally muscled up the courage and left him. She fled back to her parents' homestead, and unfortunately, William decided to go after her because she held the secrets of him abusing her, and he wanted his wife back. So he went back to the homestead of her parents, and he intended on dragging Ellen back with him to his homestead. So Mr. Thomas Watson refused William access to his daughter. Thank God. Okay. So he had threatened to unalive William if he didn't leave. And William gave up and he left. And it's believed that once William left the house that night, that he never had contact with Ellen again. At least we don't see that in the history books. So now that Ellen seemingly closed that horrific chapter in her life from William, she decided that she was going to pack her belongings and take a leap of faith. So Ellen moved to Red Cloud, Nebraska at the end of 1883 to start a new life. And she found work at a hotel, established a new residency, and finally filed for divorce from William. Now, once she filed for divorce, we don't ever hear if that divorce went through or not. We're just assuming it did, but we don't have any court documentation or anything like that to show that the divorce actually went through the court and they were legally divorced at this time. So once she divorced him, she had found work at this hotel, and she worked there for a little while, getting extra money, doing a couple of extra things. And then she decided that she was going to move to Denver, Colorado, as one of her younger brothers lived there, and she was going to visit and see what's going on in Denver for a little while. When she got to Denver, she stayed a couple of months or so, but then she decided she wanted to move on to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And she stayed there for a little bit, a couple months again. She supported herself working as a seamstress and a cook. And for whatever reason, she did not care for Cheyenne that much. And so she decided to move again in 1885, this time following the railroad to Rawlins, Wyoming, where she also found work as a seamstress, a cook, and a waitress in one of the newly erected buildings in Rawlins, Wyoming. This premier building was the best boarding house in town, so it housed all the railroad workers, and this was dubbed the Rawlins House, which is actually still here to this day. So in 1886, Ellen had been living and working in Rawlins, Wyoming for a full year. I'm going to curl my eyelashes, but I'll keep talking. Ellen's life had drastically improved in the last few years that she was away from William, and she was grateful for the opportunities that were afforded to her. Unbeknownst to Ellen, her life was about to change directions again. On February 24th, 1886, Ellen encountered a man named James Jim Averill. She was working at the hotel, or the boarding house, in Rawlins, and Jim, who happened to be in Rawlins to file a homestead claim for land that he acquired along the Sweetwater River, stayed in that boarding house. So after establishing his homestead, Jim opened a restaurant and general store that catered to settlers heading out west on a route later known as the Oregon Trail. So Jim is telling Ellen all of these things while she cooked him dinner, and she sat down and she was talking to him. And Ellen possessed all the skills needed to run the restaurant and general store that Jim had, and he ended up hiring Ellen to work as a cook and a general assistant at his general store. And love blossomed, of course, and the pair ended up tying the knot in the same year. Now, while Jim and Ellen are enjoying their married life, and remember, this is in 1886 is when they got married. We'll take it back a couple of years, and the United States government was already hard at work, and they were helping thousands upon thousands of pioneers heading west to establish their own slice of heaven during the westward movement, expansion into the American West. Okay, so on May 20th, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed into law something called the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act facilitated westward expansion by granting 160 acres of public land to settlers for a small fee, and this provided that the settlers met a certain residency criteria, and they had to also make improvements on the land, working the land for 5 years. Okay, so this significant piece of legislation aimed at promoting the settlement and development of the American West. The act allowed any adult citizen or intended citizen who had never borne arms against the United States government to claim 160 acres of surveyed public land. To obtain the land, claimants were required to pay a nominal filing fee and commit to living on and improving the land for a minimum of 5 years. After the 5 years, they could receive the title to the land for free and clear, except for a small registration fee every single year. Taxes. Now, we know that Jim had already claimed his 160 acres. Okay, so he came to Rawlins, and he was at the boarding house. He met Ellen. all of these things, boom, they're married, okay? Now, one of the stipulations of the act allowed a woman, as long as she was single, to apply for the 160 acres. So, she could only be single, not married. Now, we already know that Jim and Ellen in 1886 got married, okay? So, this would mean that Ellen could not claim 160 acres because she was married. Well, when they married, Ellen put a different last name on their marriage certificate. So she did not put her name down as Ellen Liddy Watson or Ellen Liddy Andrews, which was Jim's last name. I'm sorry, Ellen Liddy Averill, which was Jim's last name. She put her last name down as Ellen Liddy Andrews. We don't know where the Andrews name came from. This little infraction has caused historians to question the legitimacy of their marriage. Were they actually married legally, or was it a secret? We don't know. So, Ellen and Jim get married, but it was kept a secret in order for Ellen to claim land and erect a homestead on her property, is what everybody thinks. Ellen claimed the 160 acres adjacent to Jim's property, okay? Once Ellen was settled into her cabin that she had erected on her land so she could live there, Jim and Ellen lived separately to pull off the ruse that Ellen was single. Okay? Now, she used some of her savings from her previous jobs to start buying cattle and hiring cattle and ranch hands to help her work and sustain the 160 acres. Because Ellen was a seamstress and she had some of those skills, she would charge her hired hands to mend their clothing as a way of keeping an income out in the middle of nowhere with all the cowboys that she helped. Okay? Ellen and Jim worked their acreage together and maintained a herd of cattle between the two properties for several years without any trouble whatsoever. And this is where the name Cattle Kate came into. So, they took on the task of fencing off each 160 acres. Well, Ellen only was able to get 60 acres fenced until trouble started again. Now, alongside the Homestead Act, another big organization was about to be established. In 1872, the fight for grazing public lands was gaining traction. An estimated 24 cattlemen who held the biggest ranches banded together to create the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, also known as the WSGA, to protect their rights to graze their cattle on open range like they had for years before the Homestead Act even became a thing. So these problems didn't arise with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association until unpredictable storms and inclement weather in 1880 and 1881 decimated herds. We weren't getting enough snow and rain to help with the pastures to grow. There wasn't enough food for all of these cattle or water source for them. Okay. And so the cattle were unable to find any feed. They were dying off. These cattlemen had to find a different way to feed their herds. So they were forced to start growing an alternate source of food, which is hay. So the hay needs water to grow, and the only close water source was fenced in on Ellen, Kate, and Jim's properties. They had a river that ran through both their properties. So attempts were made to buy Jim and Ellen's property, but they refused to sell. They were not selling to any cattlemen. They were there to stay. They worked hard for this, and no one was going to bully them into finishing off their lands. It just was not going to happen. So, needing to feed their cattle, these big families started cutting down Jim and Ellen's fence to allow cattle access to water. Okay. While this is going on, Ellen applied to purchase her own brand to start branding her own cattle. Ellen's ranch hands were reporting back to her that every time they would go out, new fence would be cut down, or there was new cattle that was mixing in with her herd of cattle, and that these cattlemen were completely disregarding Ellen's fences to put, well, her fences, period. So Ellen, the rough and tumble Ellen that she is, decided that she was going to put up a fight, and she thought to make a culvert or a ditch to source the water from the river to her property, to irrigate it to her property, so that these big cattlemen that were trying to get to the water source and was ignoring her land, they were trying to get the water, to go to their culverts and their hay fields and all these different types of things. Well, Ellen was trying to play the long game and not be bullied into it. So she was protecting her right also, because the river was on her property. So she's trying to use the water that's on her property to help her acreage grow and flourish, and not give it to these cattlemen who are being bullies, essentially, and wanting to take everything that she worked for from her. Okay? So these cattlemen are just getting sick of it, and they're tired of her deterring them at every single turn. So they start putting up fence. They'll cut her fence down. They put their fence on her property, and Ellen's hands are reporting this back to her. And so it's just getting out of control. They're blocking her right to have a brand. And these cattlemen now are telling the sheriff that Ellen and her husband Jim are rustling their cattle, that they're deliberately trying to steal their cattle and put it in with their own to basically profit off of them and steal from them. Well, this wasn't true at all, but the posse made a gang of people, and they went and rounded up Ellen and her husband, Jim. They essentially kidnapped them at gunpoint. They drove them out in a wagon, drove them out. and they ended up lynching them a couple miles from their home. Now, was justice ever served? No, because Ellen's neighbor, Bothwell was his name, the one who kept trying to buy them out, he ended up acquiring both of their properties, Jim and Ellen's, and running a cattle ranch on them until he moved to California and died in the 1920s. Now, was Ellen naughty to make that list, or was she forced into it and just did what she could to survive? I don't know. I'd love to hear your opinions. If you have something else that you'd like me to talk about, I'd love to hear them down in the comments. And until then, God bless, and I'll see you next time.